Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. I am taken by the fact that we meet here this morning one day after the IPCC has finally, after a lot of work, been able to agree on the synthesis report that they will be releasing for the fifth assessment report. You know, over the 2 decades that the IPCC has been serving humanity, they have actually been publishing increasingly accurate risk assessments that are helping governments and all other stakeholders understand the impacts of climate change and understand the urgency of acting on climate change. And in fact, every single IPCC report has actually been increasing in its assessment of the risks. And every time, now for the 5th time, we have increasingly sobering reports on the impacts of lives, livelihoods, and the health of our population and our planet. Today, with this synthesis report that is being released, we frankly have absolutely no doubt that we human beings have caused climate change. We also have no doubt that we must address climate change, given the impacts that we're seeing everywhere, in particular here in the Arctic. Now, all of you are here because you are convinced that we must act on climate change, so I don't need to convince you about that. You will take some encouragement from knowing that you were joined just a few weeks ago by 400,000 people who came to the streets of New York, and yes, New York is in the United States, came to the streets of New York to also be very, very clear about the fact that we must act on climate change. And they were joined by thousands of other people in 130 countries in similar events. So it is very clear, I think, that humanity has decided that we must act on climate change. Then the question is, can we address climate change? Well, that is perhaps not so clear. But I'm here to tell you that we actually do have the technology and the financing that is necessary to act on climate change. And just a few little examples will suffice. So I've been privileged enough in the scarce 24 hours that I've been here in Iceland to already go to one of the geothermal plants here. In the context of a country that in 1940 was 80% coal and oil, and that is now 80% geothermal and hydro. At this particular geothermal plant, they're also doing very, very interesting research, completely cutting-edge research on carbon capture and storage that is actually answering a lot of the safety issues on capture and storage of carbon. So yes, that is one answer. We also know that wind is growing everywhere, that we will have 2,000 gigawatts of wind in more or less by 2030, which means approximately 15% of global electricity will be produced by wind. Solar is exploding, has come down in cost 80% since 2008, and is exploding in particular in China, where they are currently building one solar power plant of 1,000 megawatts, the equivalent of a nuclear reactor. We do have the technology, and we actually have the finance to address climate change. In fact, at the Secretary General's summit in New York just a few weeks ago, that summit mobilized approximately $200 billion of commitments of investment from private sources. But is that enough? Will that actually answer the question, will we effectively address climate change? And I think that is the question that brings us here together. Because there is one compelling fact. Over the next 15 years, according to the new climate economy report just released in New York, over the next 15 years, the world together will be investing $90 trillion into infrastructure. over the next 15 years, in part because the energy infrastructure is old and needs to be renewed, in part in answer to the 2 billion people who will be joining us on this planet very soon. Those 90 trillion, the funding for which is already sitting under pillows and mattresses, will have to be decided. Is that going to go into business as usual infrastructure, i.e. the technologies of last century, and non-resilient, dangerous, high-risk infrastructure, like roads and transportation? Or is it actually going to go into clean technologies and into resilient infrastructure? And if we're able to make that switch, the different cost of which is only 4 to 5%, if we're able to make that switch over the next 15 years, my friends, then we will have addressed at least the worst impacts of climate change. So the Paris Agreement, for which many of us are working, is actually the turning point that we must create for that investment to go into the clean scenario that I have spoken about. And that is exactly where the Arctic Circle comes in. You may think, okay, those crazy guys over there, they've been talking for years and years and years, and they're working toward a Paris Agreement, but here we in the Arctic Circle actually do have the answers. Well, my friends, the point is that we need your answers. We need your efforts. And why is that so? Because here the Arctic Circle, in only its second year, is already creating a platform for collaboration on solutions that actually has 3 of the fundamental characteristics that are needed by the Paris Agreement. The first is that the Arctic Circle is searching for the balance between local needs, national interests, and global responsibility, a very important characteristic of the Paris Agreement. The second is because the Arctic Circle and the Arctic Council, of course, are endeavoring to calibrate perceived short-term benefits with the long-term impacts of climate change that will affect the same beneficiaries of the short-term benefits, plus millions, if not billions, of other people around the world. And the third, because here in the Arctic, we are realizing that there is no country that is immune, that there is no one single country that can solve this problem, and that therefore our most urgent need here is to build a collaboration platform such that we ensure that no one country is left behind, that no one community is left behind, that no one family is left behind. If we are to have a solution to climate change, we must bring everyone with us for that solution. So those 3 characteristics are the same characteristics that the Paris Agreement is searching for. Governments are actually on track with respect to the timeline to this Paris Agreement. So we are working on a draft agreement that will be on every desk of every government in Lima at the end of this year, in December. In May of next year, that agreement, which will then have been further worked on, will be translated into all 6 languages of the United Nations and sent to all 194 capitals for discussion at cabinet level, because this is an agreement that cannot be put forward by one ministry. This is an agreement that has such deep implications and such deep opportunities for all sectors of human endeavor that it must receive a very careful consideration at cabinet level in every single country. And then, once that consideration has been put in place, then the governments will again be gathered in Paris in December of next year to adopt that agreement. So governments are on track for the timeline which they have set themselves to agree to the Paris Global Agreement. Are they on track with science? No. They are not on track with what is required by science, partly because they are still searching for those 3 balances that are actually being searched for here in the Arctic by the Arctic Circle and certainly by the Arctic Council. So, my friends, there is no doubt that the Arctic is the nerve center of climate change impacts, but I am convinced that the Arctic can also be the solution center for climate change. So let us work together to ensure that the kinds of issues, the kinds of collaborative platforms that you're building here, you can also take to inspire and inform a Paris Agreement that must bring resolution to the climate challenge. And how are we going to know whether that is actually the case? We will know that if the Paris Agreement is actually the turning point that takes us to global peaking of emissions over the next 10 years and then to climate neutrality in the second half of the century. If we are able to chart that path, if we're able to mark the milestones of that course toward climate neutrality in the second half of the century, which is what the IPCC requires of humanity, then we will know that we have stood up to our responsibility. I'm frequently asked by journalists, what keeps you up at night? Well, the fact is many things keep me up at night, but one in particular. I have this recurring vision of 7 pairs of eyes in front of me, belonging to 7 generations ahead of us. And they all ask me, you knew, and what did you do? My friends, I'm not the only one that is going to be asked that question. Every single one of us alive today is facing that same question. So my invitation and my trust is that we're all working together to be able to answer that question in the way that we want to. We knew, and we did. Thank you.